At 71 years old, I learned something that took me an entire lifetime to understand. The people I trusted the most, the people I laughed with, helped, and defended for decades, were never really my friends. For years I thought loyalty meant the people who showed up to your parties and sat next to you at the bar. But one quiet moment in my life exposed a painful truth. And once you see that truth, you can't pretend you didn't notice it. My name is Thomas Walker, and for most of my life I believed I had a lot of friends. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood where everybody seemed to know everybody. Back in the 1960s, the streets were always full of kids riding bikes, playing baseball, or racing each other to the corner store for soda. My father worked long shifts at a machine factory, and my mother worked part-time at a grocery store. We didn't have much money, but we had something that felt just as valuable back then: community. One of my closest childhood friends was a kid named Eddie Lawson. Eddie lived 2 houses down, and we spent nearly every afternoon together. Summers were for baseball games in an empty field near the train tracks, and winters meant shooting basketball in his driveway until our hands froze. When you're young, friendships feel permanent. You assume the people around you will always stay around. But life has a way of quietly changing things. By the time I turned 27, I had moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, chasing the same thing most young men chase: opportunity. The city was growing fast in the late 80s, and construction companies were expanding everywhere. I started working as a supervisor for a building materials distributor that supplied lumber and hardware to contractors all across the state. The work was demanding, but I was willing to grind. Long hours didn't bother me. Early mornings didn't scare me. And slowly, year after year, the effort began to pay off. By my early 40s, I had worked my way into an executive position. The paychecks were better than anything I imagined when I was a kid in Ohio. I bought a house in the suburbs, upgraded my old pickup truck, and finally felt like life was moving in the right direction. And that's when something interesting began to happen. My circle of friends suddenly started growing. At first it seemed normal. A few coworkers invited me out after work to watch football games. Then a couple of local business owners introduced themselves at networking events. Soon I was spending Friday nights at the same sports bar with a regular group of guys. There was Kevin Brooks, who always had the loudest laugh in the room. Aaron Mitchell, who talked constantly about new business ideas and investment opportunities. And Steve Parker, the kind of guy who slapped you on the back and called you buddy every time he saw you. Back then, I believed those men were my closest friends. Every weekend we gathered somewhere. Sometimes it was the sports bar watching NFL games. Sometimes it was backyard barbecues with cold beer and country music playing through cheap speakers. Other nights we played poker and told stories until midnight. Looking back now, there's something important I wish I had noticed earlier. Most of those friendships appeared right around the time my career started taking off. But when life feels exciting and successful, you don't stop to question things like that. You assume loyalty comes with time. Whenever those guys needed help, I helped them. When Aaron pitched a restaurant investment idea, I contributed money. When Kevin needed a recommendation for a management job at our company, I made the call. When Steve told me he was struggling financially after a bad business deal, I loaned him money without hesitation. Because that's what friends do, or at least that's what I believed. For nearly 20 years, life moved forward like that. My career kept improving. I invested in a few rental properties and eventually bought a small fishing boat that I kept at a nearby lake. Financially, things were comfortable, maybe even a little better than comfortable. My social life always seemed busy. There were always people around. Weekend cookouts, football Sundays, road trips to watch games. The house was rarely quiet. But here's something I didn't understand back then. Sometimes noise hides the truth. The truth started revealing itself the year I turned 66. That was the year I decided to retire. After more than 4 decades of working long hours and constantly managing responsibilities, I finally stepped away from the business world. At first, it felt strange waking up without emails or deadlines waiting for me, but I assumed something would remain the same: my friendships. After all, these were men I had known for decades, or at least that's what I thought. Within a few months, something strange started happening. The phone stopped ringing. Text messages became shorter and less frequent. Friday night gatherings continued, but somehow I wasn't hearing about them anymore. At first I told myself everyone was just busy. Life happens. People have families and responsibilities. But deep down something didn't feel right. One afternoon I decided to call Kevin. After all, he used to describe me as one of his closest friends. The conversation lasted barely 2 minutes. He said he was busy and promised we'd catch up soon. We never did. Aaron stopped responding to my messages entirely. Steve, the man who still owed me money from years earlier, suddenly became impossible to reach. And that's when a question slowly began forming in my mind. Had these people ever really been my friends? Or had they simply been enjoying the life I used to have? That thought stayed with me for months. But the moment that truly opened my eyes happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on my front porch drinking coffee when an old pickup truck pulled into my driveway. The driver stepped out, and it took me a moment to recognize him. It was Daniel Carter. Daniel had worked for me years earlier at one of our warehouses. He wasn't part of the loud social circle. In fact, he rarely joined us at the sports bar or the big weekend gatherings. We hadn't spoken in nearly 3 years. Daniel walked up the steps holding a small paper bag. "Figured you might be hungry," he said. Inside the bag were 2 burgers from a diner we used to visit during long work days. We sat on the porch talking for hours about family, about life after retirement, and about how strange it feels when the busy part of your life suddenly slows down. At one point during that conversation, Daniel said something that stayed with me long after he drove away. "Tom," he said, "the people who stick around when life gets quiet, those are your real friends." I didn't say anything right away because suddenly everything started making sense. The loud friendships I had built for decades were built around activity, around business, parties, and excitement. Over the next few years, my social circle became much smaller than it used to be. But something strange happened. The fewer people in my life, the more meaningful those relationships felt. A few months ago, I hosted a small cookout in my backyard. Only 3 people came. Daniel was there with his wife. My neighbor Margaret Lewis brought homemade apple pie, and an old co-worker named Frank Delgado stopped by after finishing his shift. But something about that evening felt richer than any party I had hosted 20 years earlier, because every person sitting at that table had proven something. They showed up when life wasn't exciting. They showed up when there was nothing to gain. And that's when I finally understood something that took me 71 years to learn. Friendship isn't measured by how many people surround you when life is comfortable. It's measured by who remains when life becomes quiet. Some people are there for the ride, but the rare ones, the truly valuable ones, are there for you. So if you're listening to this story right now, here's a question worth asking yourself. If tomorrow everything in your life changed, if the success disappeared, if the excitement faded, if life slowed down completely, who would still show up at your door? Because those are your real friends. And once you recognize them, don't take them for granted. It took me 71 years to learn that lesson. Hopefully it won't take you that long. If this story made you reflect on the friendships in your own life, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about life lessons and real experiences like this, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.